Freedom Day. It's apt that this year's theme for World Press Freedom Day is information as a public good. This draws attention to the invaluable role of journalists in producing news as verified information for public interest. Having access to accurate and comprehensive news coverage has never been more important. This day, dedicated to freedom of press, underscores the need for governments across the world to respect their commitment to press freedom. World Press Freedom Day is also a day of showing solidarity with journalists who brave the toughest conditions to disseminate information and bring news from across the world to our homes. This day continues to remain extremely relevant as we think of journalists reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic. These journalists are handling conflicting reports, the uncertainty about the virus itself. They're reporting from the front lines, dealing with the rapid pace of developments, and also negotiating an outpour of scientific information. Several journalists have also lost their lives while reporting on the pandemic, especially in countries like Brazil, India, Peru, and Mexico. Today, the World Press Freedom Day also remains relevant as we witness online attacks on female journalists, and these have increased significantly over the last few years. For women journalists and media workers, gender based attacks continue to be a persistent part of their daily routine. As journalists continue to face censorship, harassment, and even death for their work, on this day we remember all those journalists who have continued to report the truth despite all odds, especially journalists in Myanmar and other conflict areas who face real threats of being detained, tortured, and silenced for reporting on crimes committed by the military rulers and dictators in their countries. To mark this day, I'm joined by four amazing women today who are leading the work of their newsrooms and working to provide communities independent, reliable, and unbiased information. They represent newsrooms that are inclusive and diverse. The content that is produced by their newsrooms includes perspectives and voices that are often missing from mainstream media. Please join me in welcoming Asham, the founder of Debunk Media in Kenya. Asha is an award winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. Debunk Media is a pioneering digital media outlet in Kenya that brings together journalists, data scientists, filmmakers, and artists through the art of storytelling to make sense of issues that affect us all. We also welcome Devi Asmarani, who is the editor and chief and co founder of Magdalene, a feminist web magazine in Indonesia. Devi has been in journalism for over 20 years and has written news reports, award winning in depth reports and analysis on various issues from politics, conflict, and terrorism to natural disasters. Magdalene accommodates the voices of feminist, pluralist, and progressive groups. We welcome Lara Bitar, who is the founding editor of The Public Source, a Beirut based independent media organization that is dedicated to reporting on socioeconomic and environmental crises affecting Lebanon since the 90s. She has over a decade of experience in journalism as a news producer, editor, translator, and movement journalist. The Public Source has been providing political commentary on events unfolding in Lebanon since the uprising of October 17, 2019. We welcome Tania L. Montalvo, who is the executive editor of Animal Politico in Mexico. Tania leads the multimedia team to hack stories in new formats for different audiences. She also coordinates investigations focusing on corruption, human rights, inequality, and violence. Animal Politico is a medium that puts citizens at the center, privileging dialogue with them and covering issues that affect them. Welcome, Asha, Tanya, Lara, and Devi. Thank you very much for joining us today. Um, the way this event is organized is that we'll have some questions for all panelists for the first 30 minutes. And we'll try and cover some of the areas that media newsrooms are facing today. We also have time for questions from all of you, the audience that has joined us today. Thank you for joining us from different regions and time zones. We encourage you to use the Q&A option to post any comments or questions that you have, and we'll address those questions as part of the discussion. So let's start by talking about COVID-19. We're all living in a pandemic, and this pandemic is affecting all aspects of our lives and work. So, for this year, the index that Reporters Without Borders (RSF) has reports a dramatic deterioration in people's access to information and an increase in obstacles to news coverage. And RSF has also noted that the COVID-19 pandemic has been used to prevent journalists from accessing information and to restrict critical reporting. So I'd like to ask all of you about your experience of covering the pandemic. What has been that experience, and how have you negotiated some of these restrictions in your regions?
I guess maybe I can volunteer to go first, or did you want to pick someone?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Lara.
Okay, sure. First of all, thank you, Shalini, for hosting, and to Midan as well, of course. Before we start, also allow me to express our solidarity to the catastrophic events happening in India and also around the world. In Lebanon right now, just like a lot of places around the world, we're not just experiencing the COVID pandemic, but we're also experiencing a lot of overlapping crises, some new, some that have been fermenting for a few years, if not longer. In August of last year, Lebanon experienced one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, which was the explosion that took place at the Beirut port. While at the same time, Lebanon has been experiencing a seemingly never-ending free fall in terms of its economic and financial situation. So all of these different crises have impacted the way journalists do their work, and have definitely impacted our ability to move. We've had a few complete nationwide lockdowns. And this has impacted, in particular, independent media practitioners who are not recognized by the state as journalists, who don't have press passes, who don't work for media organizations that are recognized by the state. So there's been a severe restriction on our ability to move, on our ability to access information, because these lockdowns, of course, have impacted different government institutions and administrations. So simple things like filing access to information requests take significantly longer. And shortly after the blast, the country was in a state of emergency for a couple of weeks. That has also impacted our ability to report, our ability to be on the street. And the imposition of this semi-military rule of sorts has led to an increased attack on journalists, whether physical attacks or attacks through the use of the judiciary. Slander and defamation laws in Lebanon are one of the many tools that are used to restrict journalists and activists and others to express themselves, be it on social media or in the print press. So as far as tactics of maneuvering around these restrictions, we've had to deal with the situation on a day-to-day basis and improvise. For example, at the public source, we've tried to get recognition of a foreign press organization for press passes, for example. We've tried to build alliances and partnerships with other organizations. We've tried to seek legal representation, to kind of prepare ourselves for the worst case scenarios. So all of these are just small tactics that we've tried to use in order to maneuver around all of these different restrictions. But also, since the uprising started in late 2019, there's been a burgeoning of organizing, and in particular, when it comes to media workers. There's an alternative press syndicate that was formed at the end of 2019, and it's played a very important and crucial role in pushing back against some of these haphazard measures and new policies that the state has been imposing, and in particular, the information ministry. So, for example, when the first lockdown back in March of 2020 was imposed, journalists out on the street were getting fined for being out and trying to report on what was going on. The alternative press syndicate, played a crucial role in pushing back and protecting journalists and their ability to gather information and relay it to the public. And I think I'll end here.
Yeah. Tanya, I was wondering if you wanted to come in at this point and talk a little bit about Mexico, because Mexico has also reported a lot of deaths of journalists reporting on the pandemic. What has been your experience? How have you negotiated the restrictions and also the challenging circumstances under which journalists have to report?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you for the invitation. Well, yes, I mean the situation in Mexico, it's we don't have like never like a lockdown, like applied lockdown. So in that terms, for example, our work as journalists has not been limited, for example, in any way. But the thing is that to have access to data, it's very complicated. Like we have, of course, the data from the government, but the government itself, for example, they during all the year, they change a lot of times of sources, data, and they didn't explain what was happening. So sometimes it's complicated trying to understand why, for example, they were using some charts trying to explain pandemic in Mexico, and a couple of weeks later, they using a completely different data. So reporting was in that terms kind of complicated because the speech here in Mexico when journalists trying to understand what is happening with pandemic, with the pandemic, what's happening with the data that the government is changing all the time. Sometimes it looks that they are hiding, of course. It's that the official speech from government, it's that the media is the enemy. We heard a lot of times from the president, from the health minister, from authorities, like that journalists are getting worse the pandemic because the way that we were informing what is happening with COVID. So when, for example, we have a new crisis, a new wave of cases, the answer of the government is most of the time related with the way that journalists are covering pandemic and provoking this crisis, this chaos, because so the attacks against the press using COVID, it's really hard all the time. For example, we can't hear about an authority saying that a newspaper is fake news, using that terrible term, because that newspaper published something about the pandemic, like saying something like, we use data, we consult, for example, international data that it's collecting information about COVID, and the report said that in Mexico City, there are underreported deaths because if you compare, for example, death documents, because the death versus the death reported, we have more these death documents emitted by a health minister versus the ones that you were actually reporting on TV, for example. And when that happened, all the authorities started deny the report, saying that it was exaggerated, that was fake news. So the journalists, the media, they receive all the online harassment, because it's important to say that the Mexican government has an approval of over 65%. So the president has a press conference every morning. He talked for 3 hours all days. So when the president talks, he it's very used to say that the press is lying, that the press is against the government, that the press is trying to scare you. So it's very easy to the president in that press conference to say that this report showing that the deaths of COVID are worse, to say that that's false, and there is a lot of harassment against the media and against the journalists. So the situation, what we can do, of course, we of course we are doing a lot of field reporting with a lot of security measures, like trying to talk with people and to understand what's happening with people. For example, the oxygen, the lack of oxygen. We also have that in Mexico City, and the authorities said that everything was okay. So the answer is to report that on the field. See how there is these queues, large queues, people trying to get oxygen, and with that evidence of people talking about what they are living, it's kind of impossible for the official speech to stop what we are doing, the journalism that we are reporting for people.
Asha, I was thinking that in your context, in the Kenyan context, you've had a lockdown recently. There's also been a state crackdown on media. How has the situation been in the pandemic with the lockdown and with the state already cracking down on media? And how have you negotiated this situation?
Thank you, Shalini, and it's great to be a part of this panel. My apologies if my video is a bit shaky sometimes. I'm experiencing bad internet. But really, from the onset of the pandemic last year, it's been incredibly difficult for Kenyan journalists to report on COVID-19. So one good example is that when we got the first cases of COVID-19 in March of 2020, there was a curfew. And the first day of the curfew was 27th of March. So the curfew is supposed to begin at 6 p.m. And in one of the port cities, it was supposed to begin at 7 p.m., sorry. One of our port cities, Mombasa, we experienced like really crazy violence on the first day of the curfew. So at 6 p.m., just before the curfew is beginning, police come and crack down on people leaving the ferry, on citizens. And that basically set the tone for how the police responded to COVID-19, to a health pandemic, in the context of having a night curfew, and people were being clobbered, and there was a lot of tear gas. And one of the things that happened is that a journalist from one of the leading TV stations was attacked by a police officer and his camera confiscated. So that set the tone for reporting, really, for journalists. So we were reporting not just on the health pandemic, but also on very violent police force, very violent response by the police force, enforcing the curfews and enforcing the restrictions. So media found themselves at crossroads. One, you're reporting a health pandemic, but you're also reporting all these other things that are happening around the pandemic. So we saw a lot of journalists being denied access to places where they were supposed to report. We saw people being stopped in the evenings when the curfew was in effect, especially the night curfew, from reporting in zones where authorities were using excessive force against citizens to either enforce the curfew or to enforce restrictions. So that was really difficult for media to report. In the context of when you compare the Kenyan situation when it comes to government information on COVID and data on COVID, when you compare Kenya to some of our neighbors, for instance, Tanzania, where there hasn't been any data released by government for a couple of months, you would say that really Kenya has done fairly well. The government has done fairly well when it comes to reporting data. We do have daily briefings from the Ministry of Health where we get the top layer of data, which is how many people have tested positive, how many deaths do we have so far, and how many recoveries do we have so far. When you look now at the intricate details of that data, that is when the question marks begin to pop up. So first and foremost, for a big part of last year, we had politicians going around the country holding massive rallies, very similar to the case of India, where on one hand, government is telling people to stay at home and to wear masks and to not gather in big gatherings, big public gatherings. And on the flip side, politicians are out politicking and holding rallies and, allowing people to gather, mass gatherings for political events. So this mismatch became a really tough thing to report on for a lot of journalists, because then you have to call out politicians, you have to do a lot of the investigative work around what the data really is telling us. So apart from this top layer information that I've told you about, we rarely get information about who is really dying of COVID, what are the age groups, what is informing government decision. For instance, 1 month ago, we went into another lockdown because we were getting into a third wave of infections. And yet, just a couple of days ago, the president has already lifted the lockdown. And there's already questions of what exactly is informing these decisions. So I think for a lot of journalists, this has been sort of like the push and pull of how to report on the ongoing, with a lot of information constantly changing, government position constantly changing, the strategies constantly changing. And then on the flip side, there being all these issues around police brutality within the pandemic. So I can say that 2020 and the first quarter of this year has been a very difficult space for journalists to navigate. For us, I work at a smaller media house. It's an independent digital media house, and I think the advantage that we have at Debunk Media is that we have a lot more time to really analyze the data, to scrape the data, to tell people the deeper nuances that perhaps traditional media might not be able to tackle in their day-to-day stories. We're also able to prioritize voices of experts. We're able to go back and look at the issues that were really big last year and then give deeper context to them. But I think all in all, it's been a really difficult space to navigate. And every day just presents a learning point for all of us.
Devi, how has it been in the Indonesian context? We have so many reports about the Asia Pacific region having serious restrictions, placing serious restrictions on journalists. We have countries like Malaysia, that's your neighbor, cracking down on journalists reporting on the pandemic. There have been laws passed in countries like Hong Kong and Singapore to stop journalists from covering the pandemic. And there have been data related issues everywhere, like how do people access data on the pandemic while there are such serious restrictions on mobility, etc. So what has been the experience of Magdalene in this?
Yeah, so thank you, Shalini, and thank you, Midan, for having me. So I've been listening to all these other journalists and their experiences in their countries, which are incredible and horrible at the same time. Slightly fortunately, in Indonesia, it hasn't been as bad since the pandemic. There has been no systemic or institutional restriction on journalists other than concerns about health. in terms of reporting. However, we have to admit that in the beginning, well, most of the time, but especially in the beginning, particularly in the beginning, the government was handling the crisis pretty badly. And there was a lot of incompetent, moves. The direction of the policies were not clear. There were a lot of flip-flopping and decisions of lockdown. So naturally, there were a lot of criticism regarding that. At the same time, there is always the classic problem of the lack of data, the availability of data, and most of the information coming from the government. So, the whole daily online press conference and all that stuff, which didn't really yield a lot of use, I guess I would say, accurate and impactful data. And there was a sense that the data was being cooked, or, it was being handled to make the situation not look as bad, or under control, look as if it was under control. So, and at the same time, even though there was no restriction per se, but there's also a lot of concerns about journalists, health and safety. There was not, in the beginning, as probably happening all over the world, there was not very, even within the medical, like in hospitals, and doctors and health workers were struggling with getting safety gear, much less a reporter. It was even hard to find good mask at the time. So there was that concern. And so there was a sense that it wasn't being covered as it should be, other than what, people are saying, all these talking heads and stuff like that. But there was but I want to highlight a couple of things that happened during the pandemic that is actually a threat to, that has been a threat to free press, or freedom of expression and freedom of press. There is this law, we've had this law, that is Law of Information and Electronic Transaction, that has been around for some time, for 11 years. And it has been, since it was passed, it's been used as a kind of rubber law that's been, on the one hand, it could be used for what it was, supposed to be, which is for, electronic transaction or digital crimes. But on the other hand, it has also been used to do a lot of things, including persecuting people who are actually victims, or criminalizing critics of government, or a lot of things. Now, during the pandemic, actually, the number of time, or the number of cases in which this law was used to persecute or to criminalize people have gone up a lot, significantly. And 40%. So there's a lot of lawsuits going on, and a lot of them were filed by public officials, including governments, or heads of state institutions, or cabinet ministers, security officers, and as well as the general public, professionals, and businesses. And they target, the lawsuits target journalists or media companies, activists, lecturers, teachers, artists, writers, and general public. So people who just write a very critical tweet on Twitter or something like that. And oftentimes, maybe the case doesn't really go all the way to trial and stuff, but it's it's enough to really intimidate you, to make you think about what you're gonna tweet, or what you're going to say, or what you're going to say in media, or what the media would write or publish about. So that is quite a serious threat that has gone up. So even if we don't have a law per se that restrict journalism, this law that has been around for some time and has been kind of there has been some red flags over, and people have been trying to review this law, is still a threat, and it will still be used for purposes other than what it is supposed to be. As for Magdalene, like I think Asha was talking about. We are, we're small media. We don't cover the news, like we don't have daily, we don't cover ongoing news. We do a lot of articles, and so the pandemic has, forced us to work at home, like literally at home. I mean, I don't have a budget for if somebody, one of my reporter, has to go, contracts COVID, for example. So I said, you guys just work from home. Everybody works from home, and it's been like that in the past year. We would meet sometimes, but we focus mostly on how the pandemic affect women. And one of the biggest impact of the pandemic is the violence, domestic violence, that has been on the increase. So we create a whole program to focus on that, on how the pandemic has increased violence against women, and also violence in the violence, online violence against women. And it's not been easy for us too. So we're talking about the impact of the pandemic. I'm not sure whether this is related to the pandemic, but as you know, pandemic, forces people to exist online, basically. And Magdalene has always not been, Magdalene is always easy to gain enemies because of the point of views that we have. We are feminists, and we are quite critical of some of the things. And so for maybe a month last year, we were under heavy attacks. First it was on Twitter, on social media, and then the attacks started happening on our website. So our website was down like every day for almost a month, and we were struggling because it really affected our everything, and we didn't have a lot of budget to kind of create a safe system. So we were really struggling. And apparently the attack also happened to other independent media, probably similar to us, that is known for critical critical coverage and things like that. Luckily that was passed. We managed to move our server, and and we did some of the stuff to ensure that we will be safe after that. And but still, it was quite a struggle for us at the time. So maybe I'll start from there.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, everyone. It's really a challenging time for all of us, and especially for those reporting on the pandemic, and even those who are reporting on how the pandemic is affecting communities, especially women and other vulnerable communities. Thanks for your responses. I wanted to talk a little bit about misinformation, given that we're seeing a lot of misinformation around the pandemic. We are seeing fake news regulations related to, who's being targeted on reporting on COVID-19. Um, so I wanted to ask Tanya, since you've also been part of a fact-checking initiative, what have been some of the strategies to combat misinformation, especially that related to the pandemic, that Animal Politico has adopted?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I think that the most important thing is to be allied with people that actually knows about health issues. I mean, we as journalists, of course, we can report a lot of things as fact checkers. We can, maybe it's easier to have some answers, but there is a lot of things that it's very important to have as ally people, academics, especially it's doctors. We in Animal Politico, for example, right now, because of COVID, we create like an alliance with some doctors, medical personnel, that it's actually helping us to understand what's happening. Because I think that the principal challenge for misinformation in terms of COVID, it's that, yes, of course, it's there is a lot of things that are very viral, that we are in front of a phenomenon completely new and that people it's very scared of. So that's very good material for misinformation, disinformation. But I think that the principal ingredient is authorities being the origin of disinformation, and that happening in Mexico, but also in other countries. What happens if you have the president saying that this medicine is good against COVID, and in fact that medicine is terrible with COVID, or there is no evidence that you have to use that medicine with COVID? So I think what I mean is like, the fight against the disinformation, it's not only the viral thing that it's very common between, for example, families or communities. It's you have to fight this phenomenon in a massive way, because you have here in Mexico, we have the president at the beginning of pandemic saying that nothing happened. Go out to take dinner, go out and visit your family. Everything it's okay. Please go out. And as I mentioned, with a president that with more than 75% of approval, people was like, oh, okay, even though health minister was saying the opposite thing, like we in that moment, we in Mexico had this slogan of staying home, like quédate en casa, staying home. But the president was, no, everything is okay. For example, at some point, the president was saying that he didn't need vaccination. And so people was start saying, well, if the president, if he's saying that this doesn't want the vaccine, so why do I have it? So that kind of things, it's like a very massive disinformation, and it's a completely different phenomenon. The best way to fight against that, it's in groups, like in alliance with academic, with people, with other media, trying to explain in different ways, not necessarily because it's very complicated to say that, okay, I mean, the president maybe is lying, but if you immediately said that the president is lying, probably will happen this phenomenon that people will be against you. So it's not pointing that someone is a liar or it's not a liar, or that you are wrong or that you are not wrong, but trying to explain what is happening and how, for example, vaccines, or how using a medicine that it's not recommended could have consequences for you. And also, I think that it's very important to move the disinformation phenomenon to the real world, and to, for example, with dioxide of chloro, to explain how are the real consequences of using it, with real stories, talking with someone that probably is sick, or probably it's dead, because trying to use this miracle product. In that way, it's we can fight against this kind of misinformation that as I said, it's massive right now in terms of COVID.
Yeah, and we are also seeing governments starting their own fact-checking units and putting out sometimes more misinformation. We're seeing this in Mexico, in India as well, and in many other countries. So it's quite worrying the way in which governments and important political leaders have been spreading misinformation during the pandemic. Lara, did you want to make a point about misinformation in the context of Lebanon as well?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm going to be very brief. So we're a very small media organization, and obviously we don't have the capacity to report on current events and happenings on a daily basis. A lot of our reporting comes in the form of long form, in-depth and investigative reporting. So the flip side of this information or misinformation conversation is misconceptions that are built through state propaganda. So what we've been doing is trying to fight a little bit against these misconceptions that are built that way. I'll give quickly two examples. Since the beginning of last year, or first 3 months of last year until towards the end of the year, we tracked the state response and the Ministry of Health's response to the pandemic. Because at a certain point, there was a lot of excitement and self-congratulations that the ministry had done such a superb job. Granted, they had not, the death toll in Lebanon from COVID is almost 7,300. And Lebanon is a very, very small country. So that's quite a big death toll. So we had been tracking the response throughout the year. And then towards the end of the year, we published a report that kind of analyzes this response and evaluates it. It's a timeline of what the state did at what point, kind of to combat this idea that the ministry and others had conducted such a wonderful job. The same applies to, for example, now again, because Lebanon is facing a financial and economic collapse, there's been a lot of conversations around corruption and fighting corruption and what does that entail. And another misconception is that some of this recently passed legislation is going to salvage the country and rescue the economy and so on. So my colleagues, Gadi Mirhej and Cynthia Isa, did also a long report tackling some of this legislation, combating this idea that this is legislation that's going to save the country. So this is kind of just a brief snapshot of how we deal with this question of disinformation.
Asha, how are you looking at this in the context of Kenya?
I think, like very many African countries, misinformation has been, another pandemic really during the last 1 year. For instance, early last year, there was a lot of false information going around about the virus, about the origins of the virus and possible cures. Countries like Kenya and even South Africa and many of the big economies in Africa suffer this challenge of misinformation, which is widely spread on social media. You'll see reports that 25% of Kenyans get their news on social media. What does that mean? They are very susceptible to fake news, and it doesn't discriminate whether you're learned or not, whether you're a professor or not, because the big population holds very strong cultural or religious views. And so it's very easy, people become very susceptible, even the most learned of people, to fake news. You find a lot of half-baked advice about COVID and the remedies, sketchy remedies shared on WhatsApp, very misguided theories about the virus. And WhatsApp is the biggest platform, for example, social media platform that is used in Kenya and a lot of the African countries. So then this becomes a very, very good tool to spread fake news and misinformation. You find a lot of people in WhatsApp groups, family groups, spreading a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake news around the virus. And what we've done, even before I founded Debunk Media, when I was working for Citizen TV, which is the biggest TV station in Kenya, was to really show people that fast COVID does exist, because there was a lot of denialism. A big population in Kenya really was asymptomatic from the very beginning. So there were all these reports of people testing positive, but then, the ordinary Kenyan would ask you, even as a journalist, when you go to interview them about COVID, and they would ask you, where is this COVID? I do not know anyone around me who has COVID. And that's because a lot of the people were initially asymptomatic. That's before the virus spread across the population. So at the very beginning, it was to first even interview people. There was stigma. People who had COVID did not want to say that they had it. So it was, how do we show people that the virus exists? That was the basic of fighting misinformation. And then, of course, there's a lot of mistrust in authorities, in media, number one, and also in government, because there are issues of corruption. The citizens will ask, how can we trust the government when we feel that maybe it's just the money, that the public funds that are going to be stolen through the issues of the pandemic. And so the virus does exist. So that was step one. Then step two is to explain the data. Our media is not very data driven. You don't see a lot of data driven stories, for instance, in traditional media. So how do you explain to people what the curve means, what terms like flattening the curve means, why they should pay attention to the data that is released by government, why they shouldn't listen to the remedies. So like Tanya said, it was a lot to do with putting the trusted sources, who are the experts, who are the doctors, at the forefront of this fight for misinformation, that it wasn't going to be possible to do it just from journalists and government voices, that the people really to be put at the forefront were the experts. And that's really, I think, what has helped. Also, I think it's about being proactive rather than reactive, because I think in the fact-checking world, we all know a lot of fact-checking is very reactive. So this is the fake news that is spreading around. Let's go and debunk it, and let's go and tell people what the truth is, right? But how do you become reactive? This became very important for us at Debunk Media, especially when it came to vaccines. Kenya, just like very many African countries, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, because of course there's all this history about vaccines and African bodies and Black bodies. And so of course the first reaction from everyone is hesitancy when you talk about new vaccines, when you talk about vaccine trials. So instead of being reactive and waiting for to see all the fake news or all the disinformation spreading around the vaccines, it was to really start to give out factual, credible information about the vaccine even before the rollout began. So I think that we've seen has been a very good, it's been very helpful for us as a small media platform. And the fact that we're on social media also helps, because that's where the fake news is. So we push a lot of content out on WhatsApp, we push a lot of content out on Instagram and on Twitter, and we do a lot of multimedia audiovisual material where, especially like the young audiences can relate to, and then they can forward that content to the WhatsApp groups where their aunties, their mothers, their fathers, their uncles are. And, we all know that, the aunties are the ones who are very susceptible to fake news on WhatsApp. So that's kind of been like the kind of strategies that we've used for us as a small media house.
Thank you. I think it's great what you're saying about being proactive and putting out information. This is also a conversation that we were having earlier today. We have a group of 6 Indian fact checkers who formed a coalition called Ekta Facts. And this group is actively looking at misinformation around the COVID pandemic, because there's been such a surge of the virus and infections in India. And this is exactly what we were discussing in the morning today, that just, sometimes putting out explainers, putting out information to just debunk all the misinformation that's floating on social media, especially on WhatsApp, is really important. And like you said, I agree, having the voices of people and their experiences is also equally important. Um, I wanted to talk about diversity in newsrooms. It's World Press Freedom Day today. Diversity in newsrooms still remains a huge issue. There's a huge gap there that we see. There's, of course, a gender diversity gap, but we also see other gaps in terms of um, people from different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, who are part of news media and newsrooms. The lack of diversity also means that sometimes the perspectives of people, especially women, in news is missing. And we know from recent reports that there are very few women in top editorial positions in newsrooms. So Devi, I wanted to ask you about running a feminist newsroom in Indonesia. What has that experience been like? And how do you ensure that there are diverse and plural voices in the news that you produce?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it hasn't been a very easy journey. We were established in 2013, and it was just me and my partner, Hera. And we didn't know much about the business part of media, but we've been a journalist for a long time, and so we focusing on content. Our really where we came from was that we wanted to create media, a platform that women like us want to read, because a lot of the time, what we know about women focused media is, mostly about lifestyle and fashion, beauty and whatnot. But meanwhile, the mainstream media are still very masculine, and even some of them in Indonesia are kind of misogynistic. So we came from that kind of motivation. We had this drive to create this, something that women who want to find information, want to read, want to consume, and it would help them and stuff like that. We didn't really envision ourselves as a feminist publication in the beginning, because we were just journalists. We create content, but then as we went along, a couple of months after that, I realized that we are feminists, and we should just claim that. We should just own that. And I think it shocked people in the beginning to see that this kind of content would come from Indonesia-based publication. It seemed very, provocative, very refreshing, and because we deconstruct a lot of things that has been taken for granted, in a very patriarchal society. We question a lot of norms, religious traditions, and things like that. And so that's how we've been going on, and that's how we gain followers as well as haters, of course. Over time, though, we realized that if we just focus on this, the feminist part of this, then we're not gonna expand. So what we've been trying to do is we make our content a lot more digestible for people. The feminism is still there, the value is there in all of our content, in all our perspective, but we cover things like pop culture and things like that. So the perspective is very much feminist. And when I say feminist, I'm not just talking about women, but also intersectional feminists. So we look at it from very different, we build into it issues like racism, caste, classism, and things like that, colorism. And so and I think this strikes a chord in a lot of Indonesian readers, particularly women, because when you look at Indonesian media right now, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that says that even in the mainstream media, only 11% of women are quoted in news, as news sources in their news, and the perspective, of course, is very masculine, and there are a lot of the practices still very much reflect the very patriarchal, still very objectifying women and sexualizing women and things like that. And we're not even talking about the minority gender and sexuality, which has been very bad. The coverage has been very, very bad. So what we're trying to do in Magdalene is, aside from, because as I said, we come from our basis is intersectional feminism. So we look at it from that, from that point of view. Whenever we are covering an issue, we make sure that whose voices are being heard here. How does this impact affect the how will our readers how will they get, what will they get from this? It's not just information, but we're also building knowledge and insight that would help them, that would help enrich their perspective. So, so I would say it's journalism with a cost. It's not like propaganda journalism. It's not like that, but it's, you know, it's journalism with a cost, because we look at issues that we cover. For example, like I said, during the pandemic, we focus on how the pandemic affect women from all sorts of, you know, spectrum and all sorts of issues, and particularly violence. And then we also make sure that the sources that we speak to, the news sources that we speak to, are balanced. We make sure that you know, we're not going to interview with somebody about an issue that actually affect other, you know, what, like for example, interviewing a very an able person on a disabled issue, for example, you know, something like that. We make sure that everything is you know, fair, and also you know, as it I guess I would say I'm not sure how to articulate this, but you know what I'm saying. So yeah, and in terms of our newsroom, we also, I think we have a, you know, the editorial is largely women. There are some men, but you know, we're very inclusive in terms of, you know, we have some, you know, transgender reporter staff, and so we make sure that, you know, we're very inclusive in terms of who we're hiring and who we work with. There's another thing, because we are quite big in social media and we have events and communities. When we work with influencer, for example, we make sure, you know, we look at them and, you know, kind of see their backgrounds and how they fit into this intersectional feminism, feminist values that we, you know, that we believe in. So things like that, you know, a lot of it is, I mean, we try not to be too just black or white. We try to build nuances into what we do, but the core belief is there. You know, our core belief is equality and, you know, and inclusivity. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does. And I hope that in the coming years, we have many more newsrooms that are diverse and inclusive, and have different voices in the newsroom and also in the content that is produced. We are almost at time. There are some questions that we have from our attendees here. I'm going to request the speakers to respond to the questions briefly, if you can. So we have one question from Maria Carolina Bello. And Maria wants to know about how do you avoid being a government mouthpiece and not earn the ire of the government at the same time? Lara, would you like to respond to this?
Sure. I'm trying to find the question. How do we avoid being government mouthpiece? How about I answer the other question? That's the one I saw about Clara from Bali.
Yeah.
So the question reads, in the midst of the many criticism, threats, obstacles that you've received, what is the main reason you keep in this profession, and how have you responded to the threats and obstacles you may have faced so far? Very briefly, I would say, if you're a journalist or if you're in journalism and you believe that what you're doing is a public service, I suppose the only reason you would leave is either you get burnt out or you get laid off. It's for me, journalism is not a career, and this is why I built the public source with my colleagues in the hopes of providing a public service and working for, I hope, what would be the public good. And as far as obstacles and threats, we're very new, so we haven't received any threats yet. But we've definitely faced an array of obstacles every step of the way. And because we're a journalist-run publication. We're also community rooted. So we've managed to face a lot of these obstacles by getting the support and the solidarity of our readership, but also the communities who we give space to on our platform.
Thanks. We also have a question from Claire Ting, who's from Verifiles in the Philippines. Claire's question is about COVID-19 and how several countries are seeing a surge despite having vaccines that have been approved. So what have your countries ever wanted to frame that the surge was more because of uncontrollable circumstances, such as the existence of more variants, instead of how the governments responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, such as how a lockdown was implemented or how health protocols were loosened? And if yes, how did journalists in your country respond to this? It's a question that we are facing here in India as well. I think it's probably things that, sorry, it's probably a combination of new variants that we are seeing, but at least in the context of India, there's been a lot of criticism of the government in its response to the pandemic. There are reports that are saying that the government had been alerted earlier this year and did nothing to control the spread of the pandemic or the new variant. And actually, there were huge rallies and big gatherings, public gatherings that actually led to the rapid spread of the virus and the new variant at this point. It's something that we need to seek a response from the government for this, and something that in the Indian context, again, I would say many journalists are finding quite difficult to do that because of the way in which media is being controlled by the government and how independent media is facing a huge crackdown, and also several restrictions are being placed on independent voices in media. So we are at time now, and we'd like to end this event by thanking all the 4 panelists for coming here, for your time and for your inputs today. Thanks very much, Lara, Asha, Tanya, and Devi. And as a group that's committed to improving the quality and equity of online information, Midan and Czech Global will continue to support and strengthen the work of independent journalists and newsrooms through the work with our partners. A big thank you to all those in attendance. If we could not respond to your question, we're sorry for that, but we'll try and respond to you later. And I hope that you found this event useful and inspiring. Please do get in touch if you'd like to know more about Midan's ongoing projects and some of our upcoming events that are part of the Czech Global project. Stay safe, take care of yourself, your loved ones, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.